John Miller drove through the busy streets of New York City, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel as he listened to the morning news. The fall air was crisp, and the leaves on the trees in Central Park had started to change colors. John worked as a senior political correspondent for National News Network for the past 15 years. He loved his job, especially during times like these when politics seemed to be on everyone's mind. His phone rang through the car speakers. It was his boss, Susan Bennett. "John, are you sitting down?" Susan asked, her voice filled with excitement. "I'm driving, so yes, technically I am sitting," John replied with a small smile. "We just confirmed both Michael Moore and Kash Patel for tonight's panel discussion. Can you believe it? The famous filmmaker and the former Defense Department official on the same stage." John nearly missed a red light as he processed this information. "You're kidding. How did you manage that? Those two have completely opposite political views." "That's exactly why it's going to make for amazing television," Susan said. "I need you to come in early today. We need to prepare questions that will get them talking about the issues without turning the whole thing into a shouting match." John agreed and hung up. He knew tonight would be interesting, but he had no idea just how memorable it would become. At the studio, the energy was different. Everyone moved a little faster, spoke a little louder. Big names meant big ratings, and the network executives were already buzzing around the control room. Susan had called in extra staff to handle what she expected would be a larger-than-normal audience. "The social media team is ready to clip any noteworthy moments," said Paul Green, the digital content manager. "We're expecting this to trend tonight." Susan nodded as she reviewed her notes. "Make sure we have extra security on standby. I don't think anything will happen, but better safe than sorry." The makeup room had been divided into two separate areas to keep the guests apart before the show. Network policy usually had all guests meet briefly before going on air, but Susan had decided that the first time Moore and Patel saw each other tonight would be under the bright studio lights. "Is that really necessary?" John asked as he reviewed his questions for the evening. "Trust me," Susan replied. "The tension will make for better television." By 4 in the afternoon, word had leaked to other media outlets that the two men would be appearing together. Competing networks had already started promoting their own coverage of what National News Network was calling the debate of the season. At 5:30, Michael Moore arrived at the studio. He wore his trademark baseball cap and casual clothes. He greeted the staff warmly but seemed focused, carrying a folder of notes and asking for a quiet place to review them. "Mr. Moore, it's an honor to have you on our show," said Nancy Rogers, the makeup artist who had worked at the network for over 20 years. "My husband and I have seen all your documentaries." Moore smiled at her as she applied powder to reduce the shine on his face under the hot studio lights. "Thanks for saying that. Tonight's going to be interesting, isn't it?" "That's one way to put it," Nancy replied carefully. On the other side of the studio, Kash Patel arrived 15 minutes later. Unlike Moore, he came with an assistant who carried his briefcase. Patel wore a dark blue suit and red tie. He chatted easily with the staff, asking people's names and making small talk. "How long have you worked here?" he asked Nancy, when it was his turn in the makeup chair. "Over 20 years now," she said, selecting a brush. "You must have some stories to tell," Patel said with a smile. "Nothing I can share, I'm afraid," Nancy replied. "Part of the job is being like a priest in a confession booth. What happens in the makeup chair stays in the makeup chair," Patel laughed. "Fair enough." In the control room, Susan was reviewing the camera angles with the director, Steve Wilson. "I want tight shots of their faces when the other one is speaking. Reactions are everything tonight." "Got it," Steve said, instructing his camera operators through their headsets. "George, you'll be on Moore. Linda, you stay with Patel. Kevin, you handle the wide shots and our host." The studio audience began filing in at 6:30. The show wasn't normally filmed before a live audience, but Susan had made an exception tonight. She wanted the energy that only a crowd could provide. The seats filled quickly with people who had lined up outside the building since early afternoon. Frank Davis, the show's host for the past 5 years, reviewed his notes one last time. He had moderated many heated debates before, but even he felt the unusual weight of tonight's show. His phone had been buzzing all day with messages from friends and family who had heard about the upcoming showdown. "Remember," Susan told him, during their final meeting, "let them talk, let them argue if needed, but don't let it get completely out of hand. If things get too heated, go to commercial." Frank nodded. "Any topics to avoid?" "Not tonight," Susan replied. "Everything is fair game. That's why people will tune in." At exactly 7 o'clock, the red light on camera 1 lit up. The show's theme music played, and Frank Davis welcomed the audience at home. "Good evening and welcome to The Bottom Line. I'm your host, Frank Davis. Tonight we have 2 guests who represent very different perspectives on American politics and society." The camera panned to show Michael Moore sitting on one side of Frank, looking serious but composed. Filmmaker and activist Michael Moore, whose documentaries have challenged corporate power and government policies for decades. The camera then moved to show Kash Patel on the other side, sitting straight and appearing confident. And former Department of Defense official Kash Patel, who has served in numerous government positions and has been an outspoken critic of what he calls the deep state. The tension was visible immediately. Though both men nodded politely at their introductions, neither smiled at the other. The studio audience, sensing the atmosphere, grew quiet with anticipation. "Gentlemen, thank you both for being here," Frank continued. "Tonight we'll be discussing government transparency, national security concerns, and the role of media in our democracy. Let's begin with a basic question for both of you. How much information should the government share with its citizens?" Moore spoke first, leaning slightly forward. "The American people pay for their government. They elect their representatives. They deserve to know what's being done in their name and with their money. Secrecy should be the rare exception, not the rule." Patel nodded slightly. "I agree that transparency is important, but there are legitimate national security concerns that require some information to remain classified. The challenge is finding the right balance." For the first 20 minutes, the conversation remained surprisingly civil. The 2 men disagreed on many points but expressed their views without interrupting each other. The studio audience seemed almost disappointed by the lack of fireworks. Behind the scenes, Susan paced in the control room. "This is too polite," she muttered to Steve. "Ratings will drop if they keep playing nice." "Give it time," Steve replied. "We're just getting started." Outside the studio, regular Americans were tuning in across the country. In Ohio, Betty Johnson watched while folding laundry. In Florida, Peter Williams texted his friend, "Are you watching this? Not as exciting as I thought it would be." Little did they know that everything was about to change. As Frank Davis introduced the segment on classified information and public interest, something shifted in Kash Patel's expression. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes focused and intense. "Frank, if I may," Patel said, interrupting the host's question. "The American people deserve to know what's happening behind closed doors, especially when it affects their freedoms. And I can tell you with certainty that documents exist proving that certain media figures have been directly coordinating with government officials to control narratives." The control room suddenly erupted in activity. Susan grabbed her headset. "Stay on Moore, get his reaction." Camera operator George Smith quickly adjusted his frame, capturing the moment that would soon be replayed millions of times across the country and around the world. Michael Moore's face changed instantly. His eyes grew wide and his cheeks turned bright red. He sat up straight in his chair and gripped the armrests tightly. Everyone in the studio could see that Patel's words had struck a nerve. The audience, which had been relatively quiet during the first part of the show, now leaned forward in their seats. "Are you seriously suggesting what I think you're suggesting?" Moore asked, his voice rising with each word. He pulled his microphone closer. "That's an absolutely outrageous claim without evidence. This is exactly the kind of dangerous rhetoric that undermines public trust." Frank Davis, the host, tried to jump in. "Let's slow down a bit." "No, I will not slow down," Moore interrupted, pointing his finger at Patel. "You can't just come on national television and make accusations like that without backing them up. Which media figures? What government officials? What exactly are you claiming here?" Patel remained calm, which seemed to frustrate Moore even more. "I'm stating facts based on documents I've seen during my time in government. There are journalists who take direction from government agencies about what stories to cover and how to cover them. The control room was buzzing with excitement. Susan Bennett, the producer, was giving rapid-fire instructions to her team. "Stay on more. Keep that close up. This is gold." Steve Wilson, the director, signaled to the camera operators. "George, don't lose that shot of Moore's face. Linda, be ready to cut to Patel's reaction." On screens across America, viewers watched as Moore became more and more agitated. In Chicago, college student Mary Anderson grabbed her phone and started recording the TV screen. "You guys have to see this," she texted her friends. "Moore is about to explode on live TV." Back in the studio, Moore removed his glasses and wiped them nervously before putting them back on. This is exactly the kind of conspiracy theory that damages our democracy. You're making sweeping accusations without naming names or providing any proof. Patel smiled slightly. "I understand why this makes you uncomfortable, Michael, but I'm not making this up. There are documents." "What documents?" Moore demanded, cutting him off. "If these documents exist, show them, release them. Let the public see this so-called evidence." Frank Davis tried again to regain control of the conversation. "Perhaps we could discuss the broader issue of media. Independence without—" "No, Frank," Moore said firmly. "This needs to be addressed right now. What Kash is suggesting is that journalists are government puppets. As someone who has worked in media for decades, I find that deeply offensive and dangerous." The audience was completely silent now, watching the drama unfold. Some people had their phones out, recording the exchange. Network executives were already calling Susan, sensing that something big was happening on their channel. Patel leaned back in his chair, still appearing relaxed. "I'm not suggesting all media is compromised, but there are specific instances where certain stories were buried or promoted based on government request. That's not a conspiracy theory, it's documented fact." Moore shook his head vigorously. "Name one. Give me one specific example with proof." Patel looked directly at Moore. "During the last administration, 3 major news networks killed stories about foreign interference after calls from the State Department. I've seen the communications. The studio felt like it was charged with electricity." Frank Davis looked at his notes, clearly trying to find a way to steer the conversation back to safer ground, but it was too late. The planned discussion had been completely derailed. In homes across America, social media was exploding with activity. Videos of Moore's reaction were being shared thousands of times per minute. Hashtags like Moore Freakout and Patel Bombshell started trending almost immediately. In Ohio, Betty Johnson called her husband into the living room. "You have to see this. That filmmaker guy looks like he's about to have a heart attack." In Florida, Peter Williams was no longer bored. He posted online, "This is the most honest moment I've seen on TV in years. Moore can't handle the truth." Back in the control room, Susan was ecstatic. "This is going to be everywhere tomorrow. Extend the segment, push back the commercial break." Steve nodded, speaking into his headset to alert the technical team of the schedule change. "We're extending by 5 minutes. Everyone stay sharp." On camera, Moore was becoming more animated. His hands were moving as he spoke, his voice getting louder. "What you're doing is dangerous. You're undermining trust in journalism without any accountability. If you have evidence, you should present it through proper channels, not make vague accusations on TV." Patel remained composed. "I'm not being vague. I'm being as specific as I legally can be without violating confidentiality laws. But the American people deserve to know that what they read and watch is sometimes directly influenced by government agencies." Frank Davis tried once more to regain control. "Let's take a step back and look at the broader issue of—" "No," Moore exclaimed, loud enough that the microphone crackled slightly. "There is no broader issue here. What we have is a former government official making serious allegations without providing evidence. That's not starting a conversation. That's starting a fire." The audience was completely captivated. No one was checking their phones or whispering to the person next to them. All eyes were on the 2 men as the tension continued to build. Nancy Rogers, the makeup artist, watched from the side of the studio, shaking her head. In her 20 years at the network, she had never seen anything quite like this. "This is going to be all anyone talks about tomorrow? she whispered to a nearby cameraman. As the confrontation continued, the crew noticed that Moore was sweating under the studio lights. His face was still red, and he kept adjusting his position in his chair as if he couldn't get comfortable. Patel, meanwhile, maintained his composed demeanor. "Michael, I understand your reaction. The truth can be uncomfortable, but denying it doesn't make it go away." That comment seemed to push Moore even closer to the edge. "The truth? You haven't provided any truth, just accusations. This is exactly what's wrong with political discourse today. People throw bombs without any regard for the damage they cause." Frank Davis looked at his producer off camera, silently asking what he should do. Susan made a circular motion with her finger, signaling him to keep it going. "Let me ask you both this," Frank said, trying a new approach. "How can viewers at home determine what information to trust in today's media environment?" It was a reasonable question, but Moore wasn't ready to move on. "They can start by being skeptical of people who make wild claims without evidence. What Kash is doing right now is exactly why people don't know what to believe anymore." Patel shook his head. "Actually, what I'm doing is pulling back the curtain on why people should be skeptical of certain media narratives. I'm not asking viewers to take my word for it. I'm suggesting they look more carefully at which stories get covered and which don't." The tension in the studio was almost unbearable. The production assistants standing off camera were exchanging wide-eyed looks. Even the most experienced staff members had never seen a guest as visibly upset as Moore was becoming. In the control room, Susan checked the live viewership numbers and gasped. "Our audience just doubled in the last 10 minutes. Word is spreading." Steve nodded. "Social media is going crazy. This clip is going to be everywhere within the hour." As the segment approached its extended time limit, Frank Davis prepared to send the show to commercial. "We need to take a quick break, but we'll continue this discussion when we return. Stay with us." The red light on the main camera turned off, indicating they were no longer live. But instead of the typical relaxed atmosphere during a commercial break, the tension remained high. Moore immediately removed his microphone and stood up. "This is ridiculous," he said to no one in particular. "I'm not going to sit here and listen to this without any pushback." Frank looked concerned. "Michael, please. We'll address your concerns after the break. This is an important conversation." Moore shook his head as a production assistant tried to fix his microphone. "Important? This is irresponsible. He's making accusations that could damage the entire journalism profession." Across the studio, Patel remained seated, watching Moore with interest. He sipped water from a glass and reviewed his notes, seemingly unbothered by the chaos he had created. As the floor director counted down to going live again, everyone wondered what would happen when the camera started rolling once more. The commercial break lasted only 2 minutes, but it felt much longer to everyone in the studio. Susan Bennett rushed from the control room to the stage, moving quickly past camera equipment and crew members. She needed to make sure Moore would stay for the rest of the show. "Michael, please," she said in a hushed voice when she reached him. "This is important television. The viewers deserve to hear both sides of this conversation." Moore stood with his arms crossed, his baseball cap slightly askew. "This isn't a conversation. It's irresponsible fear-mongering without any facts." Susan glanced at her watch. "We have 40 seconds before we're back on air. Please just sit down and finish the segment. You can have the last word." Moore looked around the studio. The audience was watching him closely. Some people had their phones out, probably hoping to capture more drama. After a long moment, he sighed and sat back down. "Fine, but I want it on record that I strongly object to these baseless accusations." Susan nodded quickly and hurried back to the control room just as the floor director started the countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2. He pointed silently at Frank Davis to indicate they were live again. "Welcome back to The Bottom Line," Frank said smoothly, as if the tension during the break had never happened. "We're continuing our discussion with filmmaker Michael Moore and former Defense Department official Kash Patel. Before the break, we were discussing some serious allegations about media and government coordination." Moore jumped in immediately. "Yes, and I want to be very clear that what Mr. Patel is suggesting is not only false but dangerous to our democracy. When government officials make vague accusations without evidence, it erodes public trust in important institutions. Patel smiled. Slightly. There's nothing vague about what I'm saying. During my time in government, I saw direct evidence of certain media outlets killing stories at the request of government officials. That's not conspiracy theory, it's fact. Moore shook his head. Then name names. Tell us which media outlets. Tell us which government officials. Without specifics, this is just fear-mongering. Frank tried to steer the conversation in a more productive direction. Perhaps we could discuss what proper oversight of media should look like. But Moore wasn't ready to move on. His face had turned red again, and he leaned forward in his chair. No, I'm not going to let this go. You can't just drop a bomb like this and then hide behind vague statements. The audience was completely silent, watching the exchange like a tennis match, heads turning from Moore to Patel and back again. In the control room, Susan could barely contain her excitement. The ratings were climbing by the minute. I understand why this upsets you, Michael, Patel said calmly. But the American people deserve to know that what they see and read isn't always the full story. There are documented cases of news organizations changing headlines, burying stories, or spinning narratives based on government pressure. Moore's hands were shaking slightly as he reached for his water glass. That's an extraordinary claim that requires extraordinary evidence. You haven't provided a single shred of proof. Across America, viewers were captivated. In Chicago, Mary Anderson's video clip of Moore's initial reaction had already been shared thousands of times. Her phone kept buzzing with notifications as more people shared and commented on it. This is blowing up, she texted her roommate. I've never seen anything like this on a news show. In Denver, restaurant owner Sam Martinez turned up the volume on the bar television as customers gathered around to watch. This is better than any reality show, he told the bartender. Back in the studio, Patel decided to be more specific. Let me give you a concrete example. Last year, a major news network was preparing to run a story about security vulnerabilities at several government facilities. Before the story aired, the network received a call from a high-ranking official. Suddenly, the story was shelved. No explanation was given to the public. Moore scoffed. One anecdote without names or dates isn't evidence, it's gossip. It's not gossip when I've seen the documentation, Patel replied. The communications between the network and the government. Official exist. I've read them. Moore's patience was clearly running thin. Then release them. If you have this smoking gun evidence, why not share it with the public? Some of it remains classified, Patel said. But I'm working through proper channels to have it declassified. The American people deserve transparency. Frank Davis tried again to moderate. This raises interesting questions about the balance between national security and press freedom. There is no balance when it comes to the truth. Moore interrupted, his voice rising. Either the press is free to report facts without government interference, or we don't have a free press at all. The studio lights seemed to grow hotter as the debate intensified. Camera operators adjusted their focus, making sure to capture every expression and gesture. George Smith, the cameraman assigned to Moore, zoomed in slightly to capture the beads of sweat now visible on the filmmaker's forehead. In the control room, Steve Wilson directed his team with increasing excitement. Stay tight on Moore. Don't miss anything. This is historical television happening right now. Susan nodded in agreement. The phone hasn't stopped ringing. Every news outlet in the country wants to know what's happening on our set. On stage, Moore was becoming more animated with each exchange. What you're suggesting is that journalists are government puppets. As someone who has worked in media for decades, I find that deeply offensive and completely false. Patel remained composed, which seemed to frustrate Moore even more. Not all journalists, Michael, but there are documented cases of cooperation that cross ethical lines. The public should know about these cases. Then show us the documents, Moore exclaimed, slapping his hand on the armrest of his chair. If you have evidence, share it with the American people, the audience murmured in agreement. Several people nodded their heads. Frank Davis saw an opportunity to involve the audience. Perhaps we should take a question from someone here in the studio. A woman in the front row raised her hand and was quickly given a microphone. My name is Donna Lewis, and I'm a teacher from New Jersey. My question is, if what Mr. Patel is saying is true, how can ordinary citizens know what information to trust? Moore jumped in before Patel could answer. That's exactly the problem with making these kinds of accusations without evidence. It makes people doubt everything they hear and read. That's not healthy for democracy. Patel nodded thoughtfully. It's a good question, Donna. My advice would be to consume news from multiple sources and always ask yourself who benefits from a particular story being covered or not covered. As the segment continued, the tension showed no signs of easing. Moore's body language became increasingly agitated. He shifted in his chair, adjusted his glasses repeatedly, and interrupted Patel whenever he tried to speak. Frank Davis was struggling to maintain control of the conversation. Let's try to focus on solutions rather than accusations. What reforms might help restore public trust in media? The first reform would be for government officials to stop making wild accusations on television, Moore said sharply, glaring at Patel. Patel smiled. And perhaps another reform would be for journalists to disclose when they've agreed to kill or modify stories at government request. That comment pushed Moore over the edge. He stood up suddenly, startling everyone on set. This is ridiculous. I won't be part of this charade anymore. He began removing his microphone as the audience gasped. Frank Davis looked panicked. Michael, please, we still have 10 minutes left in the segment. I've heard enough, Moore said, firmly. Mr. Patel is making serious accusations without providing any real evidence. I won't lend credibility to this by continuing to debate, as if these are legitimate claims. The audience was completely silent now, watching in shock as Moore prepared to walk off the set in the middle of a live broadcast. Camera operators looked to the control room for direction, unsure whether to follow Moore or stay on Patel and Frank. In the control room, Susan was surprisingly calm. Stay with it. This is television gold. Steve nodded. Camera 3, follow Moore if he leaves. Everyone else, stay on your assigned positions. Frank Davis made one last attempt to salvage the segment. Michael, I understand your frustration, but walking away from the conversation doesn't help viewers understand these important issues. Moore paused, his microphone now in his hand rather than clipped to his shirt. He looked at the audience, then at the cameras, then back at Patel, who was watching him with interest. The entire studio held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. For several long seconds, the studio remained completely silent. Michael Moore stood with his microphone in hand, clearly torn between walking off the set and staying to defend his position. The audience watched without moving. Even the camera operators seemed to be holding their breath. Finally, Moore made his decision. He sat back down but placed his microphone on the small table beside his chair, instead of clipping it back onto his shirt. I'll stay, he said, his voice barely picked up by the table microphone. But I want the record to show that I strongly object to these baseless accusations. Frank Davis nodded quickly, relief washing over his face. Thank you, Michael, and we certainly acknowledge your objections. He turned to Patel. Kash, would you be willing to provide more concrete examples without revealing classified information? Patel leaned forward slightly. Yes. I can give another example. 3 years ago, a journalist from a major newspaper was preparing an article about foreign influence in our elections. Before publishing, this journalist received multiple calls from a government agency. After those calls, key details were removed from the story, and the focus shifted away from certain countries. Moore shook his head in obvious frustration. Again, no names, no specific details, just vague accusations that can't be verified. The details are in documents that I've seen, Patel insisted. I'm not making this up. In the control room, Susan and her team were ecstatic. Their monitors showed that viewership had tripled since the beginning of the show. News sites were already publishing headlines about the confrontation, and clips were spreading across social media platforms at record speed. We're trending #1 nationally, said Paul Green, the digital content manager, showing Susan his tablet with the latest statistics. Susan nodded. Make sure we have clean clips, ready to share as soon as the broadcast ends. This is going to be everywhere tomorrow. Back on stage, Frank Davis tried to steer the conversation in a new direction. Let's talk about potential solutions. How can we ensure both national security and press freedom? Moore picked up his microphone and clipped it back on, seemingly having decided to fully re-engage. The solution is simple. Government officials should not pressure journalists, period. And if they have concerns about a story, those concerns should be made public. Patel nodded. I agree that transparency is important, but there are legitimate national security concerns that sometimes require discretion. The issue is when that line is crossed for political reasons rather than security reasons. This was the first point of agreement between the two men, but it didn't last long. The problem, Moore continued, is that national security is often used as an excuse to hide information that would embarrass people in power. I've seen it happen countless times. Patel raised an eyebrow. So you acknowledge that government officials do sometimes pressure media outlets to change or kill stories? Moore realized his mistake too late. That's not what I said. I said national security is used as an excuse. That's different from what you're alleging, which is some kind of organized conspiracy. I never used the word conspiracy, Patel replied, calmly. I'm talking about documented instances of inappropriate influence. The debate continued to intensify. Across America, people who had never planned to watch the show were tuning in as word spread through text messages, phone calls, and social media. In Seattle, Nurse Jeff Brown was at work when his wife called him. You need to find a TV right now, she said. There's a complete meltdown happening on National News Network. In Atlanta, bartender Lucy Martinez changed all the bar televisions to the same channel as customers requested. I've never seen this. Many people want to watch a news show, she told her manager. Back in the studio, the floor director signaled to Frank that they had 10 minutes left in the broadcast. Frank nodded and prepared to move toward a conclusion. We're nearing the end of our time together, he said. I'd like to give each of you a chance to make a final statement. Moore went first, his voice steadier now but still intense. The American people deserve facts, not innuendo. What we've heard tonight from Mr. Patel are serious accusations without any concrete evidence. This kind of rhetoric damages public trust and undermines the free press that is essential to our democracy. If there is evidence of wrongdoing, it should be presented through proper channels, not tossed out as vague allegations on television. Frank turned to Patel. Your final thoughts, Kash? Patel looked directly into the camera. I understand Mr. Moore's frustration, but my concern is for the American people who deserve to know when they're not getting the full story. I've seen firsthand how government officials have influenced news coverage, and it happens more often than most people realize. I'm working to have these documents declassified so the public can judge for themselves. Until then, I encourage everyone to think critically about the news they consume and ask who benefits when certain stories are covered, or not covered. Frank nodded. Thank you both. This has certainly been one of our most memorable discussions. The show prepared to end. Moore couldn't resist adding one more comment. Just to be clear, what Mr. Patel has shared tonight is his opinion, not proven fact. No one should walk away believing these accusations without seeing actual evidence. Tension between the two men was still palpable as the show's theme music began to play. Frank turned to the camera. That's all for tonight's edition of The Bottom Line. I'm Frank Davis. Thank you for watching. The red light on the main camera turned off, signaling they were no longer on air. The audience began to murmur and stand up. Several people moved toward the stage, hoping to speak with Moore or Patel. Moore immediately removed his microphone again and stood up. His face was still flushed, and he avoided looking at Patel. A production assistant approached to escort him to the green room, but Moore waved her away. I can find my own way out, he said, his voice tight with anger. Patel remained seated, thanking Frank Davis for moderating the discussion. Unlike Moore, he seemed completely at ease, as if the heated exchange had been nothing unusual. In the ID control room, the celebration had already begun. Susan was receiving congratulatory calls from network executives who had been watching the broadcast. This is exactly the kind of television people will remember, said Alan Parker, the programming director over the phone. Raw, real, and unpredictable. Well done, Susan. Susan beamed with pride. I knew putting those two together would create sparks, but this exceeded even my expectations. As the crew began to dismantle the set, news of the confrontation was spreading across every platform. Video clips were being shared millions of times. News websites were publishing articles with headlines like, "Moore erupts after Patel's shocking claim," and "Television Showdown exposes media tensions." Mary Anderson's clip from Chicago had been viewed over 5 million times and was still spreading. She was getting interview requests from news outlets wanting to talk to the person who captured the initial reaction that started it all. In the green room, Moore paced back and forth, talking angrily on his phone. "Did you see what just happened? This was completely irresponsible. He made accusations without a shred of evidence and they just let him do it." Nancy Rogers, the makeup artist, knocked gently on the door. "Mr. Moore, would you like me to help you remove your makeup before you leave?" Moore shook his head. "No, thank you. I need to get out of here." Meanwhile, in another room, Patel was calmly giving an interview to the network's late-night news program. "I stand by everything I said tonight. The American people deserve transparency about how information is sometimes controlled." Network executives were already discussing how to capitalize on the unexpected ratings bonanza. Plans for a follow-up show were being discussed, and clips were being prepared for the morning news programs. As Moore finally left the building through a side door to avoid waiting reporters, he had no idea that the confrontation would soon become one of the most discussed television moments of the year. His face, red with anger and frustration, would be seen on screens around the world. What had started as a regular panel discussion had turned into something much bigger, a moment that would spark national conversation about media, government, and truth in the digital age. The morning after the explosive broadcast, Michael Moore woke up to his phone ringing nonstop. Friends, colleagues, and reporters were all trying to reach him. His face was on every news channel, and clips of his reaction were playing on repeat. He turned his phone off and sat on the edge of his bed, still angry about what had happened. Across town, Kash Patel was enjoying breakfast at a small cafe. Unlike Moore, he seemed to be embracing the attention. He smiled for photos with other customers and calmly answered questions from a reporter who spotted him. "I only shared what I know to be true," he told the reporter. "The American people deserve honesty." At the National News Network office, Susan Bennett arrived early to find the place buzzing with excitement. The ratings numbers had come in, and they were extraordinary. Nearly triple their normal viewership had tuned in, with millions more watching clips online. "We've never had numbers like this," Alan Parker, the programming director, said as he showed Susan the report. "The network president called me at 6 this morning. He wants to know how we can build on this momentum." Susan smiled proudly. "I'm already working on it. We should invite them both back, maybe in a month when tensions have cooled a bit." Throughout the day, the story continued to spread. Political commentators on every channel were discussing the confrontation and its implications. Some defended Moore, saying Patel's accusations were irresponsible without evidence. Others praised Patel for having the courage to speak out about government influence on media. In Chicago, Mary Anderson, the college student whose clip had gone viral overnight, woke up to find she had become temporarily famous. Her phone had so many notifications that it had stopped working properly. Local news wanted to interview her, and a national morning show had sent her a message asking how she happened to record the moment. "I was just watching TV and saw Moore's face change when Patel made that comment," she explained to friends. "I knew something big was happening, so I grabbed my phone and started recording." By noon, Moore had turned his phone back on and agreed to an interview with Diane Foster, a sympathetic host with a popular morning show. He arrived at her studio still visibly upset about the previous night. "Good morning, Michael," Diane said, as the cameras began rolling. "Thank you for joining us today. I think everyone has seen what happened last night. How are you feeling?" Moore took a deep breath. "I'm still processing it, Diane. What happened last night was dangerous and irresponsible. When someone makes unfounded accusations that threaten the foundation of independent journalism, a strong response isn't just warranted, it's necessary." Do you regret how strongly you reacted? Diane asked. Moore shook his head firmly. Not at all. The free press is essential to democracy. When government officials make vague accusations without evidence, it undermines public trust in vital institutions. Someone needed to stand up and say that's not acceptable. Meanwhile, Patel was making his own media appearances. On a popular radio show, he doubled down on his statements. I want to be clear that I'm not accusing all journalists or all media outlets, he explained. I'm talking about specific instances where government officials inappropriately influenced news coverage, and I've seen the documentation to prove it. When the host asked if he would name specific journalists or outlets, Patel was careful. I'm not targeting anyone specifically. This is about a system that sometimes allows government to have too much influence over what stories get covered and how they're presented. Back at the network, Susan was meeting with her team to plan future shows. The confrontation between Moore and Patel had created unexpected opportunities. We're launching a new series called Media Trust, she announced. We'll explore the relationship between government and news organizations, transparency in journalism, and how viewers can determine what information to trust. Paul Green, the digital content manager, showed her the latest numbers. The clips from last night have been viewed over 50 million times across all platforms. This is bigger than anything we've ever had. Across America, ordinary people were debating what they had seen. In diners, offices, and homes, conversations centered around Moore's reaction and Patel's accusations. In Denver, restaurant owner Sam Martinez found himself mediating a heated discussion between customers during lunch. Some people think Moore overreacted, he told his wife later. Others say he was right to get angry. Everyone has an opinion. 3 days after the broadcast, an unexpected development changed the conversation. A government watchdog group announced they had filed a Freedom of Information Act request for documents related to communications between government agencies and news organizations. The public debate sparked by Mr. Patel's statements deserves further investigation, the group's spokesperson said at a press conference. If these documents exist, the American people have a right to see them. Moore responded to this news with a statement on social media. I welcome any investigation that brings facts to light. What I objected to was making accusations without evidence. If Mr. Patel has seen these documents, they should be released to the public through proper channels. 1 week after the infamous broadcast, the story took another turn when a senior editor at a major newspaper published an opinion piece confirming that government officials had indeed pressured his publication to alter or delay stories on multiple occasions. While I cannot speak to Mr. Patel's specific claims, the editor wrote, I can confirm that the relationship between government and media is more complicated than many Americans realize. There are legitimate instances when national security concerns justify discretion, but there are also cases where government influence crosses ethical lines. This confession sparked a new wave of discussion. Some journalists came forward with their own stories of government pressure, while others defended the independence of their organizations. 2 weeks after the broadcast, National News Network announced a special program. They had convinced both Moore and Patel to return for a moderated discussion about media independence and government transparency. This time, however, they would be joined by journalists, academics, and former government officials who could provide additional perspectives. Susan Bennett was thrilled with the plan. This is exactly the kind of substantive programming that can come from dramatic moments, she told her team. We've turned a confrontation into a conversation. The day before the special program, a congressional committee announced hearings to investigate the relationship between government agencies and news organizations. Several lawmakers cited the Moore-Patel confrontation as the catalyst for this investigation. What began as a heated exchange on television has evolved into a serious national discussion, said one senator at a press conference. The American people deserve to know if their news is being influenced by government officials. As Moore prepared for the upcoming special, he reflected on how his angry reaction had unexpectedly triggered an important public debate. While he still believed Patel should have provided more specific evidence, he recognized that their confrontation had brought attention to issues that needed discussion. Patel, for his part, felt vindicated. Though he had been criticized for making accusations without naming names, the subsequent revelations from journalists had supported his general claims. The viral moment that began with Moore's shocked face had evolved into something neither man had anticipated. A national conversation about press freedom, government transparency, and the public's right to information. As one prominent media critic wrote, "Sometimes it takes a moment of raw emotion to start an important discussion. Whatever you think about Moore's reaction or Patel's accusations, they forced us to confront questions about our media that were long overdue." The confrontation that began on a regular panel show had become much more than entertaining television. It had become a catalyst for change, proving once again that sometimes the most meaningful national conversations begin in unexpected ways.